going to be
Okay,
here.
sounds good. All right, all right. Okay, fantastic. So I'm just going to record a little opening message just for the recording, and then we'll start talking. This is David Klein from Virginia Tech and the Southern Oral History Program, recording today for the Civil Rights History Project of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Library of Congress. Today is the 1st of October, 2013, and we have the pleasure of being in High Point, North Carolina today with Mr. Robert Brown. Behind the camera is John Bishop of Media Generation and UCLA, and we also have Elaine Nichols from the museum here today, too. So I just want to start by saying thank you so much for making time in your schedule for us today.
Well, thank you for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'd like to do, I know we have a lot of ground to cover. Yeah. Oh. Fantastic. So if we could just start with your childhood, or even before your childhood, if you like, talking about your family and your roots here, I think in this area. I think that would be a great place to start.
Okay, I was born and raised here in High Point, where I live now. And my grandmother who raised me was born and raised in Anson County. That's down in eastern North Carolina. And her father, his name was Joseph Kimball Sr., was a slave in that county down there. And he was one of those who was used to help build the railroads in North Carolina, because a lot of the labor building the railroads during that period was slave labor. And interestingly enough, I became, a number of years ago, 20-some years ago, the governor appointed me, Governor Jim Martin appointed me to be the president and CEO of the North Carolina Railroad Company, which the state owns the majority shares in now. And the state owns all the shares in now. And it was like coming full circle.
I was going to say, what's that, 4 generations? 3? Yeah.
Full circle.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the other interesting things, interesting parts of my life that had to happen. But early on, my grandmother used to talk about the railroad because she was a maid up at the Southern Railroad Station here in High Point. And wherever we went, usually if the train went there, we would ride the train because she could get a discount on the tickets. And so my brother and I would go with her all over the place. And so one day she came to us and said, you know, we're going to catch the bus. We're going down to her home area called Wadesboro, but we're going to go by way of Fayetteville, North Carolina, because there's something that I want you all to see. And we were just small boys. I mean, I was probably 8, 9 years old. My brother was 11 or 12. And she said, there's something I want you all to see. And so we got on the bus and we went to Fayetteville, North Carolina. We were going to change buses there, but there was a layover. And my grandmother said, come on, we're going to walk on down here. And so she got off the bus and we asked somebody, where is the old slave mart in Fayetteville? And the fellow says, oh, you go down this street, it's just right down the road there. So we walked around there. And she said, I just wanted to bring you all here because this was the last place that my father was sold here in North Carolina, was at that slave mart in Fayetteville. And so it's the kind of thing you never really forget. It's and my grandmother was a sainted woman who believed in God and believed in helping everybody and wanted to do something. And she wanted her people to do something. She wanted me and my brother and her son, my uncle, and my mother, her daughter, to really do some meaningful things. And
what did that do for you or to you, seeing that place in Fayetteville?
it didn't do as much for me then as it did for me later. And here I am all these years later. I'm 70-some years old. And I was like 8 or 9 then. And I was old enough to understand what it was and so forth. And my brother was too. And the more I grew up and the more I studied, and I became steeped in history. History was my major subject. It was my major in college, in U.S. history in particular. And I wanted to know more. I mean, it gave me an insatiable appetite to really get some base knowledge about the history of America and the history of slavery and the Reconstruction and all that. So it piqued my interest as a young boy. And I never forgot it. Here I am all these years later, generations later, decades later, still talking about that trip. And it was incredible. And then we would go down to Wadesboro, and we go down there probably 2 or 3 times a year to see her sisters. They still lived on those farms and so forth. And we would go by, on several occasions, we would go by to see the old house where my grandmother grew up. It was an old clapboard place with no paint, a big old fireplace in there. And it was run down and so forth. And my grandmother would say, you know, we grew up here and we raised cotton and farmed out here on the land. And I would look at this place, and it was incredible. And then she'd say there was an old what they call Rosenwald School, and there was this old school building right there. In the school building, I was down there a month and a half ago in that area, and I went by there, and that school building is still there, and they're trying to renovate it a little bit now. It's still standing, all these years later. So it really piqued my interest in history and what was going on and all of that, you know.
What was your grandmother's name?
Nellie, Nellie, Nellie Marshall Brown. Her maiden name was Kendall, Nellie Kendall.
Excuse me a second. Would it?
All right, great, great. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, so maybe we could talk a little bit about just growing up then here in High Point and what that was like and your
growing
schooling.
Up it was tough.
You were born in what year now?
I was born in 1935, February 1935, and you know, we were poor, difficult circumstances. Everything was segregated. There's certain water fountains you couldn't drink out of, toilets you couldn't go to. You know, if you went places, they had a toilet. If they had a toilet for blacks, most of them did not have a toilet for blacks. So they had toilets, but you couldn't use them because they had white toilet for men, white toilet for women. But they had big signs up there, white. So you knew right away. But you know, a funny thing, we used to go, one of my favorite places to shop as a young boy and a young kid was the Woolworth store, because they would have a variety of everything, unlike Crest, S.H. Crest, or Kresge, some of the others. Woolworth would always seem to have good quality stuff, and they'd have a variety of stuff. So I liked to go into the Woolworth store, and my grandmother would take me in the Woolworth store. So in the back of the Woolworth store, there were the water fountains. You had white water, and you had colored water. Right over the fountain, you had white water, and you had colored water. So, I mean, I'm just a little boy. I don't know that much about the white water, colored water. And I would be, so one day I'm drinking out of the white water because I just thought maybe the water had a little white in it or something. And so my grandmother saw me. She was over there looking at something, and I'm there drinking water out of the white water. And she turned around, saw me drinking out of white water, and she came over there and she pulled me away from it. She said, "Boy, don't drink that. Don't drink out of that white water fountain." I said, "Mama, it ain't nothing but water. It tastes like the same water as the water over there at the colored." I said, "I just want to see what the white water was like." And she said, "It's the same water, son. It's just that people want you to drink out of the colored water." And she said, "One of these days, it'll be changed. But right now, we have to drink out of the white water and the colored water." So I said, "Well, Mama, ain't it the same water?" She said, "Oh, yeah, it's all God's water." And she said, "God's going to change it. So he's going to fix it after a while." She said, "I may not live to see it, but he's going to fix it." But thank God she lived to see that it was fixed. And thank God she lived to see that I helped to fix it. And amazingly, I helped to fix it on many sides because when I went into business in 1961, in early '61, my first major client was the F.W. Woolworth Company. My first major client. And in 1961, there was still colored and white water in the South. In 1961, there was still colored and white toilets in 1961. In 1962, 1963. And Woolworth became one of my major clients. I think they became a major client because I went to them and told them that they needed to change and that there was a change coming and they needed to get with it and have their thing stay in front of it so that they could remain a viable entity in America, indeed in the world, if they wanted to do that. And I found them interested in doing that. And it amazed me. But in a year and a half after I went to them and they hired me to do assessments around the country and to tell them what they ought to be doing in terms of their change and integrating and so forth across the country, I was the principal advisor on all of this kind of thing to that company. It was one of the major companies in America. And the people on their board of directors, from the chairman on down, were some of the major financiers in America. John J. McCloy, who was the High Commissioner in Germany after World War II to reconstruct it, he was one of the people on their board and executive committee. Fred Kirby, who was chairman of the Allegheny Corporation, which was the predecessor of all these major hedge funds and all of that. They owned the New York Central Railroad and a whole lot of other companies. They were the biggest people, financiers in America at that time. And they were the ones who were responsible for setting policy and everything else at Woolworth. And so when I got to know them and they got to know what I was doing, they would invite me to their board retreats and to golf outings and so forth at the Westchester Country Club. And I would be making presentations to their board of directors on the kinds of things they ought to be doing and what was happening in America and where we were going and that we needed to be in front of it, not behind it. And they really believed what I told them. I was fascinated just by that. And they began to tell me that there were other companies around in America who needed this kind of advice and counsel. Other companies, many of them that they controlled, all that they were big shareholders in. And so they would send me to see other CEOs and chairman of the board of this company and that company. And I got a lot of business, a lot of clients, just by following their advice and counsel on who I should go see. And every time I'd go tell them that Mr. Kirby sent me, or Mr. McCloy, who was one of the biggest lawyers in America, sent me, or he told me to call you all. Boom. I had another client immediately.
Well, maybe we could back up for just a second, and we'll back up a little bit further too. But if you could tell us just a little bit about the company that you started and when you started it and why.
I started it. I started out as a policeman here in High Point.
Well, maybe let's just back up a little bit further, and then we'll catch up with that then. So we were talking about your childhood, but maybe a little bit more about the school that you went to here. I know that was very important for you, and then your
It was
a file.
Oh, okay.
So we'll take little breaks.
Okay.
We're back. So yeah.
Well, I started out. There's a little grade school not too far away from my house called Leonard Street School. I went to the 6th grade there, and in the 7th grade, all the classes for the black schools went to William Penn High School. And so I went to William Penn High School, which was a school that was founded by the Quakers who dominated the area this area in North Carolina. And so I went there in the 7th grade. And from then on, I graduated from there in the 12th. But it was an extraordinary experience there because one of my first major experiences at William Penn was the principal came to me one day and he said, you know, you're a bright young fella and there's something that I have for you to do. And I asked him, yes, sir, what is it? He said, we have Mary McLeod Bethune coming to the school in the next few days, and I want you to be on your best behavior because I want you to meet her at the door and stay with her and guide her around the school, all around the school, and stay with her until she gets ready to leave in that afternoon. And that's what I did. I met her at the door. When the car came up with her, I met her at the door, told her who I was, and that I was going to be her escort, and I escorted her around. And she counseled me all that time. For several hours, she would tell me. She asked me about my family, about what I wanted to do with my life. And then she said, you know, you're a bright young man. You're going to do some wonderful things with your life. But she said, you got to work hard. She said, you can't just come in here every day and run and play and everything. You just got to work at it. And all the way through, all day long, she would counsel me and tell me about her life. It was an extraordinary experience. And that was one of my first real experiences in school at William Penn. And then later on, we had people like Langston Hughes to come to the school, people like Dr. Dele Boga, who was a professor at Morehouse College, who had graduated from William Penn. We had Colonel Smith, who became a colonel in the Army, who had graduated from William Penn to come back and speak and so forth. So we interfaced with a great number of people who had graduated from William Penn and who had done extremely well to come back. They would always come back and speak to the kids and do different things with us and that sort of thing. So it was a great experience, and I think that sowed the seeds for me wanting to do things. I was a voracious reader. I mean, I stayed in the library. The kids used to pick at me a lot of times. They said, "Oh man, you're going back to the library again." I played football and stuff like that, just like other kids. But I was always reading something, and I was always reading all the magazines and newspapers because I want to know what was happening in the country and in the world.
Yeah.
And so when I would go to the civics class or something like that, I would know a lot of things. By the time I was in the 10th and 11th grade, I knew a lot. I mean, I was up to date on all the current affairs and what was happening in the world. So I became, near the end of the 10th grade, I became the editor of our school paper. And I think somewhere along the line I have some of those papers now, and I go back and I read some of the editorials that I wrote as a 11th grade and 12th grade student. And sometimes I don't believe that I wrote that, in the 11th and 12th grade. But it was extraordinary, and I enjoyed it immensely.
So do you remember some of the things that you read back then? I mean, I think it's so interesting to think of being in a relatively small place like High Point, North Carolina, but you were really connecting out to a much larger world, and through some of these people that came to town.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
oh yeah. I was reading all the time. First of all, I would read all the magazines, all the big magazines that would come in to the school, in the school library. We didn't have money to get a lot, so whatever came in, the magazines and newspapers. And then from time to time, we'd have the Sunday New York Times in there from time to time. And then we would have many of the local papers in there. And I would go in, because we didn't have money to get those papers and magazines with. So I'd go in there and I'd read everything in there. And then I'd read different books about, what was happening in the world and different things. So it was, but even more than that, there was a lady who lived across the street from us. Her name was Mrs. Loudon, and she worked for a wealthy white family. And one day, I was sitting on the steps, and I had some old newspapers. I had maybe 5 or 6 newspapers there that I was going through, and I'd gotten them from somewhere. Probably got them out of garbage can, because we didn't have money to get books or newspapers or magazines. So I'd get them, I'd scrounge them up, and I'd bring them home, and I'd sit there on the porch on the steps and read them. So one day I'm reading these newspapers and so forth, and Mrs. Loudon comes home from work, and she sees me out there reading these newspapers, and she stops, and she said, "Bobby," she said, "I see you reading a lot. You love to read, don't you?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Well, I throw away newspapers and magazines every month up there where I work, and sometimes 2 or 3 times a month." She said, "They don't keep them." She said, "If you'd like them, I'll bring them all home to you." I said, "Oh, yes, ma'am." It's like the Lord himself was speaking to me. So for the next few years, she would, about 2 or 3 times a month, she would bring a big box of newspapers and magazines home. And I mean, there'd be sometimes the New York Times in there, and magazines from New York and different kinds of magazines. And I would go through and I would read every one of them. And so I became, I could go through a box of stuff and magazines, newspapers. And I find myself, all these years later, I still read every day. I read several newspapers. I probably, in the course of any day, at the end of the day, I probably have read 8, 10, sometimes 12, 15 newspapers from different parts of the country. I subscribe to newspapers from different parts of the country so that I will know what's happening in different places, and I will have some idea so that when I speak to different groups or I'm giving some my thoughts on what's happening in different areas to my clients, then, I'm giving it from a factual point of view. I'm not just pulling something out of the wind. And usually when I'm in a meeting, whether it's a board meeting, a major corporation that I might be on the board, or I might be giving a presentation, and they ask me questions, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to know what I'm talking about. It's not going to be some theory or something that I just look up in the air and pull down. I'm going to know what is going on. And that's the way I've been since I was, say, in high school. And I was that way. I've been that way in business. I've been that way at different things, jobs that I've held. When I was at the White House, when I would go in a meeting and I had done not only reading, but I had different people who always sent me different kinds of information on different communities and places in the world of information. And I still have those kind of contacts in Africa and Europe and different places around the world. So when I'm in a board meeting, I've served on the board of directors of some of the largest companies in the world, and still serve on a few. And when something comes up about one thing or another, I usually know something about it. I may not know the in-depth phase of what had happened, but I usually know something about it, and I can tell you sometimes why it happened here because it happened over there, and it made a trail over here, and it's happening there because somebody wanted that deal over here to happen. So you can put the dots together.
Right.
But the only way you can do that is they have the knowledge base to do that. You can't do that on air, And I found that out a long time ago, back in high school and college.
It's interesting that you say that because I was struck by that just reading about you and your career, that you end up operating, in this national, obviously, and international circles, but so rooted in the local. And you're coming back home to High Point and staying in High Point. So it's interesting for me to hear you say how important it is for you to understand what's happening at a very local level in the places where you work.
Yeah, because when I go into a boardroom or when I go to make a presentation to a major group in New York or London or Paris or Rome or Lagos, Nigeria, I know what I'm talking about, And not only have I read, but I've done a lot of background work. And so, and after a while, and having done it for decades, I can watch the trends, and the trends most of the time do not lie. But you got to be able to understand what happened 25 or 30 years ago and how that's coming back into the groove at this point, and have some idea of what's going to happen as a direct result of that. I was telling somebody the other day that many things are happening to American companies now having to do with race-related kind of problems, because a lot of the management in American companies and other companies have no frame of reference to these kinds of problems and what existed, because the people who were there earlier, who went through this phase, went through all the problems, they went through it, so they have an idea. But most of those people either dead and gone, or they're retired and they're no longer on the scene. The people who are there running many of the companies and many aspects of the company, many divisions of the companies, they have no idea. They have no idea of what happened way back or maybe they read a memo, but they have no idea about what's happening. And that's why you have today, and you are going to have even more so, I'd say over the next 2 or 3 years, a lot of race-related kind of problems, major companies, because they're not prepared to deal with them. They think because they have somebody who's head of diversity, something like that in the company, which is fine, that's going to be okay. But usually the person who's in charge of diversity, they may be black, or they may be white, or they may be Hispanic. But if they're not steeped in the historical aspects of what is going on and how it was fixed before and what you need to do to fix it now and how kind of changes have been made and what's happening in the marketplace and all that, if you're not versed in that, you're going to have a problem. The company's going to have a problem. Or whatever you're allied with, government agency is going to have a problem. And so now you have problems cropping up all over the place as a direct result of people not understanding the dynamics of what, or any kind of historical reference to what is going on. Because many of these problems are going on, you know, they were going on 30, 40 years ago. I've been in this business over 50 years. And we were dealing with some of this stuff 40 years ago, 30 years ago.
And now you see it coming around again.
You see it coming, making full circle. Full circle. Same kind of stuff. Because they have no reference. They don't know how to deal with it. And they have no frame of reference on much of this stuff.
I'm going to move back. You want to get just a brief couple of sentences of what your job is?
Yeah, so let's talk, if you could tell us a little bit about your time in Richmond and then coming back here and police officer, federal agent, and starting the
Just
company.
give you a little thumbnail.
Yeah. What's that? And the name of the company, yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah.
So we'll start with just after high school, I guess.
Yeah,
and,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, after high school, I went to Virginia Union University. I stayed a year there. And then my grandparents who raised me got ill. I came back home and enrolled at North Carolina A&T State University. Spent a year there, and close to the end of that school year, I went to take a police examination because I thought it was directly related to a class in sociology that I was taking under Dr. Robertson, who was the dean of the School of Social Work. And it was. I made an A in the course. I took the police exam and helped me generate some thoughts on what ought to be done. And about 2 weeks after I took that exam, which was about the end of the school year, I had a meeting. The captain of police detectives came to my house, and he saw my grandmother, and I hadn't come home from school. School was about out, and I hadn't come home from school that afternoon. So when I got home from Greensboro, my grandmother said to me, Captain Johnson from the police station has been here looking for you. And I asked him, was there anything wrong? And he said, oh, no, we just want to talk to him. And so my grandmother she was shaking. She was
Yeah, she probably didn't believe nothing was wrong.
back then, police captain come, detectives come to your house, man.
Not a good
That's
thing.
something else. That's not a good thing. So she said, well, he said he wants you to call him as soon as you get in. So I went out and called him, and I had to go across the street because we didn't have a telephone. And I went across the street in Miss Dunlap's house and called him. And he said, Robert, you're home? I said, yes, sir. He said, well, we want to come down and see you. He said, we just want to chat with you for a few minutes. I said, yes, sir, well, I'll be here. He said, well, we're going to get in the car now and come on down there. So the police station wasn't that far away. It's downtown, which was about maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes away. So he came down. And I decided I'd stand out there on the porch so that my grandfather were in the house, so I had to wait on him. So I stood out there, and they drove up, he and another police detective. Got out the car, came up on the porch, and he introduced himself. He said, "I'm Captain Johnson from the police department." And he said, "We just want to talk to you for a few minutes." And I said, "Yes, sir, what can I do for you?" He said, "Well, we want to offer you a job as a policeman." I said, "Offer me a job?" I said, "You kidding?" He said, "No, sir, we're not kidding." He said, "You took the police examination and a couple of weeks ago, and you made the highest mark that anybody ever made on the police examination. And we wanted to reach out to you and see if you wanted a job." I had just turned 21 years old. And I said, "Well, let me think about it. I'll let you know in the next day or two." He said, "Okay, well, here's my card and my phone number's on there. You call me." And so I went back in the house, and my grandmother, well, she was so nervous, my grandfather said, they said, "What do they want? You're not in any trouble, are you, Bobby?" I said, "No, ma'am." So I said, they wanted to offer me a job as a policeman. And my grandmother said, "Oh, you can't take a job as a policeman. You're in college. You got to go ahead and finish college." And both of them were ill, and, money was almost non-existent. And I said, "Mama," I said, "I don't know. Let me think about it." And so school was about out, so I went to school the next morning, and I thought about it all of that day, and I came back home that afternoon, and I went in and talked to my grandmother and grandfather. I told them, I said, "I think I'll take this job for a year or two, and then I'll go back to school, and maybe I can go to school at night, take some night classes." And so they went along with me. They said, So I took the job. I stayed on the job for a couple of years.
Were there many black police officers in High Point then?
I think there were maybe four or five. There were two black detectives and I think 2 or 3 officers. And but I took the job.
How were things in the police department then, in terms of race relations?
They were fair. They weren't the best, but they were fair. Blacks were supposed to be patrolling black areas and all that, and weren't supposed to arrest any white people. I mean, none of this was written down now. And of course, I got right in the mix because I hadn't been there for about 6 months. And one day, my partner and I was a black guy. We got a call. There was a call on the radio. I mean, radio goes out to everybody, all cars. There's a white male loose down off of Algo Street, and he's running, and all cars converge on that area, and we need to get him in tow and so forth. Anyway, we went down there, and I grew up in that area. That was the area I grew up in, so I knew all of the branches and where you could hide and couldn't hide. So I told my partner, he drove around. I told him where to let me off. He let me out, and I told him to drive around and wait at the other end of the branch over there. I said the only place that he can run and not expected to be caught is in that branch, because everywhere else, everybody's going to see him. And sure enough, that's what this guy did. He jumped in that branch and was running up the branch. And so as soon as I got out of the car, my guy drove off, I see this white guy running up through that branch. I mean, he was trucking up to that branch. So I jumped down in the branch, and I said, "Hey, stop." I said, "You're under arrest." And he said, "Nigger boy, get out of my way. You better get out of my way. You're talking about you can't arrest me no way." I said, "I can't." So I took my blackjack out, and I hit him with it, bam, and I drug him out of there. I said, "Come on, get up." And I drug him out of the branch because, you know, I'd have figured anything could happen down at the branch, and they wouldn't even find me or him till he's way away. So I hit him a couple of times and drug him out of the branch. He said, "You better not hit me no more with that blackjack." And I hit him again. So I said, "You better get up and walk, 'cause I'm gonna do more than hit you. I'm gonna take my pistol out and shoot you." So he got up. We got him up out of the branch, and as soon as we got up out of the branch, they were the police cars. I hadn't showed up on the other end, so they came back. All the cars converged. My partner and the white guys were there, and they took him. They came down there and took him, and they beat him up a little bit too, and they threw him in the car. And so I had to go up there and sign a warrant against him at the police station. And you know, I thought maybe they were, you know, something, it might say something, well, you know, you don't have to do this. But no, I went up there, signed a warrant, and everything else, and they kept him in jail. And the judge, when the trial went down, the judge threw the book at him. He stayed in jail for 3 or 4 years. And, but up until that time, I don't think there had been any kind of interfacing like that between white and black. But nobody said anything. So after that was over, you know, nobody, and this was in 1956, somewhere like that. And after that was over, nobody thought anything else about it. And nobody ever said you couldn't arrest a white. You know, it was never a written thing. But it just sort of, you know, under the current, you don't arrest white people.
But then you saw that change.
I saw that change because I arrested several more white people. I know there was a white guy on Washington Street in a black area, and I was down there one day just walking the street. And he was down there drunk and raised in particular hell on the street. And so I saw all of the blacks looking at the barbershop doors and everything, you know, and they were wondering what I was going to do because I'm there, you know, I'm just patrolling on foot that day. And so I'm walking down the street, and this guy's kind of woozy, he about half juiced, and he's walking down the street cursing and raising sand. And then he saw me, he looked up and he saw me, and he called me a nigger, you know, and stuff. So I said, okay. So I crossed the street over there where he was, and I said, "You're under arrest." And he says, "Oh," he called me a nigger again, "You can't arrest me, you better get out of my way." So I took my blackjack out and hit him one time as hard as I could hit him. And he said, "Oh, you better not hit me." No, he fell down on one knee. He said, "No." So I took my cuffs out and put the cuffs on him, strapped him up. And then I told one of the guys in the barbershop, somebody, I said, "You get on your phone and call the station and tell them to send the car down here. I got somebody under arrest." And before I could get him up and at him, cars were, sirens were coming, cars were coming, which they came down here. And they threw him in the car, and he told me, he said, "Bob, you better come on up here and sign a warrant against this rascal, you know." And I think they probably beat him up a little bit on the way up there, you know, because he was down there. So, you know, it was that kind of a situation, you know. So it was that was an interesting part of my life. And then I got a job as a federal agent. As a result of my being a policeman, I had helped some federal agents do some work. And so I got a job in New York, and my posted duty was New York City. And I started working on the mafia, and ended up, testifying in the Vito Genovese case, which is the biggest mafia case ever. Several of those guys in that case were defendants of mine. And I worked in Canada on the guy who was the biggest mafia guy there. I worked up there, and I worked in Pennsylvania and in New York, all over New York. And I made a lot of cases, some of the biggest cases ever in the Bureau. And then after about 3 years, I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted to go into the public relations business. I'd read about public relations, and this is something I wanted to do. And so I read more books and so forth. So one day I came home and told my wife, I want to go into the public relations business. And she said, oh, Robert, you don't know anything about public relations. All you know about is what you read in those books you've been reading. I said, yeah, but I know enough to know that this is what I want to do with my life. 4 or 5 months later, I resigned my job, and we packed up and came back to North Carolina. And my district supervisor at the time in New York, he said, you've been a great agent. He said, why you want to mess this up? He said, you can stay here for 20 years and you can retire and you'll be still a young man. He said, if you go to North Carolina, open up a public relations business, you know, you can't get no clients. He said, your people can't even go in a restaurant. I said, well, what are you talking about? You're going to open up a public relations business in North Carolina. He said, if you're going to do that, you ought to stay in New York. I said, no, I'm going back to North Carolina to help deal with the problems there. And I said, I'll be able to work everywhere from there. He said, okay. So I came back. The rest is history.
Now, did you have a sense that of the timing at that time, that there was something brewing?
Oh, yeah, I knew that there was some things brewing. The sit-ins had occurred, and then there were things, and I was still reading. And that's what kept me abreast, you know, New York Times and all these papers I'd read. I was living in New York, so, you know, communication there was great. And I saw where all these things were happening all over the country. And I said, oh, this is not going to go away. It's going to be a change forevermore. And so I decided that that was where I wanted to be. I wanted to be in the arena. And so I came back home to do that. I didn't feel like I could do that the way I wanted to do it in New York or somewhere like that. I needed to be in North Carolina. I needed to be where the action was going to be in the South.
Okay, great. And so you, if you could tell us about just the name of the company and when you started it.
Okay, I started in at the end of 1960, December 1960. I came back here and started this business. And then, you know, I pursued it, and I had a 1960 Rambler car, and I would go around. I made up a list of the companies. I made up a scenario of what I wanted to do and so forth, and how I wanted to do it. And then I went around to see if I could go in these doors, go in the doors and see these people at these companies. And I got to see a lot of them. I'd drive different places. And many times I'd have to sleep in my car. If it was in the South, I'd sleep in my car because I couldn't get a hotel. And if I was in the North, many times, if I was driving to New York or somewhere else, many times I wouldn't have the money. I'd have to have the money to save money for my gas. And so I'd sleep in my car, go to the Y and have a shower and shave and change clothes. And I'd keep a nice pressed suit and shirt and tie. And they wouldn't know whether I came out of the Waldorf Astoria or whether I came out of the back of my car. So I would do that, and that's the way I pursued it. And I pursued it with some vigor and kept doing it.
And the company name? Sorry.
The name of my company is B&C Associates. When I started out, I had a friend of mine who had just come back from the service. He'd been in service, and he stayed with me. His name was Campbell, and he stayed with me for about 3 months. And after that time, he says, hey, look, I got to go find myself a job. My wife says, I got to find a job here. I said, you know, I don't know whether this thing is going to work here or not. So he left, and I just never changed the name. I said, hey, look, what's in the name anyway? So I kept the name and kept on moving. You know.
Now, so often I think, you know, when we think of the movement or making change, you know, we think of these big public events and not what's happening behind the scenes or the closed doors or the money or the public relations that it takes. Could you talk about a little bit about what it does take to make change happen, to make a movement?
From a company point of view?
Yeah, from a company point of view. Yeah, I mean, both, I think. And Yeah, well, and I'll ask some more
Well,
questions
you
too,
know,
but let's
you-
start there.
You couldn't, from a civil rights point of view, I had access to a number of companies. I had some access to some funding from these companies, and I did some very innovative things because what I would do if, for instance, when I started working closer with Dr. King and Reverend Y.T. Walker, who was Dr. King's assistant and executive vice president of SCLC, he was literally running everything on a day-to-day basis, and they needed all kind of help. They told me up front they needed help, and they did. They needed help with money. They need logistical help with this and that and the other, opening doors. And I used what I had. For instance, many of these companies that I worked with, they would budget so much money for this and this, that, and the other, and they'd tell me, you have access to this and that and the other. And some of them, I didn't have any budget. I mean, I just did what I needed to do and bill them for it. So what I would do is, if Dr. King and the movement needed my help in many ways, and many times that was like finding a meeting, they needed a meeting, and the hotels many times would not go along with them for all kinds of reasons. They'd have them putting up this and that and the other. And I'd come in and say, okay, I'll pay this bill. I'll pay that bill. So many of the movements that took place, I underwrote them. And then I would either suck up that bill myself if I had the flexibility that month or during that period, or I would charge off to one of the major companies, Woolworth or some of them, and then I would tell them, you know, I have to have this flexibility to do, you know, to work with everybody, and I want this flexibility. If you'll work with me, this is the way I work. So I just charge it off as a business development kind of thing, and that was it.
Now, what would a Woolworths, you talked about how really one of your first major client really opened the doors to a lot of other clients, but what did they want from you? I mean, how did they put that into, what did they want you to do for them? I mean, they saw the winds of change, right? But what did that mean exactly?
Well, they didn't know what it meant. And seriously, you know, they didn't understand, because nothing like this had ever happened in America before. Nothing like this had ever happened in our country before. There was nothing that they could compare it with. They couldn't go to the Harvard Business School and say, hey, look, how do you put this, what is the equation, what kind of equation you use on this one? They couldn't do that. And so, you know, I was plowing up new ground. There was nothing to compare. There were no books written on this, because nothing like this had ever happened in America before. So I had to use my own judgment, my own ingenuity, and so forth. And my ingenuity told me, and what my grandmother raised me, she said, just do the right thing. And my grandmother was living there, and I would talk to her many times, say, Mama, I got to deal with this and this, that, and the other. And she would tell me, she would tell me over and over again, she said, Martin Luther King Jr. is a wonderful man, and those fellas, Bobby, they're wonderful people. Said, you need to continue to help them all you can. She said, just do the right thing. And that's what I was trying to do, the right thing. And I knew they were on solid ground. I knew that was a winning cause. They had a lot of detractors, many in the black community, and a lot of them in the white community who did not like them, and so forth. But they were my friends, and I had to figure out all over again, time and time again, how I could be helpful to them, how I could open doors, and how I could change the attitudes of major business people in the business community about what was happening and how this would be good for our country. And I've made speeches to different groups, different heads of companies who would be meeting at the Westchester Country Club or at other places around the country, the different countries, companies, on race relations, on what do you do in a crisis situation and how you should handle it, and how to deal with change and all that. I mean, there was nothing, these were all new things in America that had never happened in America before. Never. You know, I mean, you know, since slavery was one thing, but then the 60s comes in between the 60s and between the 1960s and the 1860s, you know, you had Reconstruction and you had this and that other, and part of slavery and this, but there was nothing that they could compare themselves with that would prepare them for what was happening at that time.
From lived experience and learned experience of the 1960s, paint me a picture in the comments about it.
So all this was new ground.
Right. Now, did you have to sell them on the power of the black consumer dollar?
Oh yeah, that was a constant sell. And many times that would be the only argument that I would have because I would do research, and then I hired some professors at A&T. There was a man, his name was Dr. Sidney Evans, who was an economist at A&T. He became one of my principal consultants. He was consulting with me for 25 years. And he knew a lot about, there were other men like Sidney who I hired to work with me, who wrote papers and did all kinds of things to say to the business community, here's what the black market is. Here's what you're dealing with. And here's the power in it, not just from the standpoint of economic power, but power of the black church, power of the black schools, all kinds of latent power within the black community that was going to come and rise up, and you had to deal with this. And that was what I was selling. I was selling that, hey, look, this is coming. Whether you want it, whether you like it or dislike it, makes no difference. For the good of your company and for the good of America, you have to be in front of this. You have to deal with this. You have to make a way. Because, see, companies like Woolworth, they didn't even have a black secretary in the Woolworth headquarters building. But they had stores all over the black community in Chicago, New York. They had Woolworth stores everywhere. In California, in Watts, and everywhere. They had Woolworth stores everywhere. And they had black assistant managers many times in black areas, but very few, if any, almost no black managers of the stores in black communities. So I told them, we got to dispense with this. We got to go find us some black managers. We got to train them. We got to bring them in. We got to put people on the board of directors of the company, black people. You know, you got to put people in the executive office of the company. You got to have black buyers and all that. We did all of that at the Woolworth Company. And because we did it there and they were the biggest, the others kind of took on, they didn't have too much of a choice. Because many of these guys who were on the board, they were the most powerful businessmen in America. So if they, you know how business is, you see one doing it and the others almost going to fall in place. And they saw what was happening to a lot of them who didn't fall in place. You know, there were boycotts, there were demonstrations, there were all kinds of things. Because Woolworth was hit very hard. And you know, the strange thing about the whole Woolworth thing is that we started working with them in 1961, probably about July, August 1961. 4 or 5 years after we started working with them, and they were supposed to be, in terms of the black community, in terms of companies, the devil reincarnated. And but about 5 years later, Woolworth got 2 or 3 awards for being one of the leading companies in terms of civil rights, in terms of integration and all that, because we integrated the executive office, we integrated the board. You know, we integrated, you look at Woolworth stores around the country, we integrated that. We even had, there was a huge Woolworth store in Harlem that was owned by blacks. We changed the ownership. They had the store when it was burned out from the riots and stuff. We had the store turn around and we put it in a limited corporation where the store and the building were owned by blacks. It was a sale leaseback deal where Woolworth took a long-term lease, and the land and everything was owned by black people. We did that in several communities all across the country. And now, you know, it seems like we've gone backwards because you're doing very little of that now. With black people, you know, other people are still doing all that sale leaseback deals and this and that, but you don't have a lot of black people involved. We started this all way back.
So Woolworths knew, or I guess I should put this in the form of a question. So did Woolworths know that they really had a problem on their hands? Just the fact that their name became sort of synonymous with the pickets.
Oh yeah.
And that they had to turn that around in some way.
I think they understood. They understood. There were some people who didn't want to deal with it, I think, but they understood.
What kinds of resistance did you meet when you took on these projects for the big corporations?
I met with resistance, all kinds of resistance. I met with resistance in the black community. I met with resistance in the white community. For instance, in Birmingham, many of the guys when Dr. King was trying to get the stores down there to integrate and so forth. Well, I was working through Woolworth and some other companies because Woolworth's biggest. Woolworth says, yeah, they'll do it. But the rest of them did not want to integrate their lunch counters. They didn't want to integrate their lunching rooms and that kind of stuff. The big department stores, they didn't want to hire no blacks and this, that, and other.
Right.
So Woolworth was the big daddy in the National Retail Association at the time, and that was the big daddy of all of them. They all were members of that. And so Woolworth had me to meet with those people and give them the facts of life and everything. And so when Dr. King and Dr. Wyatt Walker went to him and talked to him about, then Woolworth passed the word down that they were going to integrate, and they were going to not only integrate, but they were going to take the business. They were going to figure out a way how to take the business, all the business, and have people come into their stores and so forth. And so the dollar signs started computing the guys, and all of a sudden, everybody starts coming together. So they got the message. The dollars went up there somewhere. They got the message, and they all agreed that there would be a certain time when all of them would come together, all the stores would integrate. Same way with the hotels. I remember when Dr. King and those integrated the hotels in Memphis, Tennessee, for instance. In Memphis, there was a hotel called the Peabody. That was the main hotel there. It may still be there. It's an old, nice hotel.
It is.
Where the ducks walk up and all that. So Dr. Wyatt Walker called me one day. He said, Bob, we got a tentative agreement with the Peabody and the downtown hotels that they're going to integrate, and we're going to have a big meeting there at some point in the next couple of months. And but we got to test the hotel to see if they're going to do the right thing first. And he said, Dr. King wants you to go there and see if they'll let you in and so forth. And so I said, well, okay, if he really wants me to do it. So I flew to Memphis. And some of the guys met me, some of the SCLC guys met me, and they were going to see what was happening. So I went there and went to the counter and told them I wanted a suite. I wanted one kind of big suites here. So they gave me a big suite, signed me up. I went up there and took the suite. And then I came back and I met with some of the guys. I said, man, well, y'all come on up. I said, we're going to have some drinks and dinner up there later on this evening. And that suite, it was a big suite. The first time a black had ever had a suite up there. But they wanted to test it to see what was going on, you know. But I mean, I used to do so many different things all over the place, all over the place. I know that there were some things going on in Richmond, and Dr. King wanted to make sure that they were worked out okay, and we got in the middle of that. And Wyatt Walker was a great tactician. He was a brilliant guy in the movement, and I don't think he ever really got the kind of credit that he deserved, because he was there during those difficult days. He left later on and went to be an executive in a publishing company in New York and took a large church there and so forth. And he's still living. He has he's been ill the last few years, and he lives in Virginia. But there were so many things going on, you know, that we were a part of and participated in some way. The Poor People's Campaign. Dr. King was planning on that when he was killed, you know, the Poor People's Campaign. This is 1968. 68 was an unbelievable, perilous year, because in 68, I'm working with Dr. King and the movement and so forth. We were doing a lot of different things. We were holding meetings. We're planning for the Poor People's Campaign and all of that. And then Dr. King is killed. And I go with Mrs. King to Memphis to pick up his body, you know. And then we had Dr. King's funeral, and the night before the funeral, I had a big suite at the Hyatt Regency in Atlanta, where we met with a lot of people like, I think Sidney Poitier was there, Robert Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, and who I'd met on several occasions. He was there with his wife Ethel, and just a whole host of people who came to the funeral, talk about where we're going in the country and all of that. And then later on, after that, Earl Graves, who had worked with me in the Bureau, and we'd been friends for a long time, called me and said, you know, we wanted to push Robert Kennedy's campaign on up to a new level. And I started working with them on that. And then a few months later, Bobby Kennedy is killed in California. And it was all this happened in 1968. And then we were still trying to plan the Poor People's Campaign. And then a few weeks later, one of my guys who's working for the Nixon campaign, who's working for Ray Bliss, who was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, black guy, Clarence Towns, wanted me to work with him, give him advice and counsel on what he ought to be doing and all that kind of stuff. And I agreed to do that 2 days a week. 2 days ran into 5 days, 5 days into 7 days. And I was handling a lot of different problems for them. And then after a few weeks, I was called in by Bob Finch, who was running Nixon's campaign. He was Lieutenant Governor of California, chairman of Nixon's campaign. He told me that Mr. Nixon wanted me to be on a plane with him, that he'd been watching what I've been doing for his campaign, and he wanted me to travel with him. So I came back home, got myself together, and went back, met the campaign in Ohio, and we went across the state on the last whistle-stop train tour that any president has taken in America. Nixon took it across Ohio. And that's where we saw the sign with the little girl holding up the sign, "Bring us together." And that became a campaign theme for us. And I worked and traveled with Nixon until the end of the campaign.
And what did you think of Nixon when you first met him or got involved in the campaign at that level?
I thought he was smart, many times intuitive, and sensitive to a great degree. I didn't consider him, a lot of people wanted to tag him as a racist. I think he wasn't a racist. He was everything but a racist. And then I got to even know him better after the campaign was over. And after the campaign was over, I told them they wanted me to go to help put the government together down in Key Biscayne. And I told them I was going back to North Carolina to put my business back together. And
I'll take a little pause. We're back.
Now you've been working through your company for Nixon, right? So were you getting paid for that? That wasn't volunteer work.
It wasn't my regular pay that, I think they paid me something. It wasn't much.
Okay. Now, when you worked with the movement, was that all just on your own dime?
Oh,
or?
that was on my own. That was
Okay.
totally. I was raising money and giving them money.
Okay.
Well, nothing being true.
Right.
I was giving them money, but it was something that I wanted to do. I felt that I needed to do it. I was making the contacts. I had the contacts, and I thought one dovetailed into another, and everybody could learn something, and the progress could be made.
Now, did King first reach out to you, or how did you make that connection with the with King and some of the other movement leaders?
I was having lunch in Atlanta with a friend of mine, Stan Scott, who ran the Atlanta Daily World, black newspaper. And he introduced me to Reverend Wyatt T. Walker, who was Dr. King's right-hand man. And Reverend Walker says to me, he said, you're in the public relations business. He said, we need your help. He said, why don't you come by the office when you finish your lunch and meet with Dr. King? So Dr. King's in town, so he would love to meet you. And I said, yeah, fine, no problem. I said, I like what he's doing. That's how it happened. I went by the office and meet Dr. King. Dr. King says, hey, look, we need your help. We're trying to raise money. We need the best minds we can get. We're just trying to make it through here.
Okay.
That's how we met.
Interesting. Yeah. So jumping back to President Nixon, then you were talking about once the government started to form that government and asked you to be a part of that.
Oh, yeah. And so I initially, I said, no, I can't do that. I got to go back and make some money. And so every day I would get a call from Ron Ziegler or somebody at the Nixon office asking me about this and what they ought to do about this, that, and the other. So one day I got a call from Haldeman. This was about the third or fourth week in November of '68. And Haldeman says, Bob, I'm calling you because the old man wants to see you, and he wants to see you right away. I said, well, I got to come to New York anyway. They were in New York. It was at the PR Hotel. That's where the transition office had been set up by that time. I said, I'll come by tomorrow. I'll come on up and come by. And so I flew to New York and went to the Pierre. Haldeman met me, and he said, I'll take you on up. So he took me up to Nixon's suite. Herbert Brownell and Bill Rogers were in there. Brownell had been Attorney General under Eisenhower, and Rogers was going to be Secretary of State. Nixon hadn't named the cabinet, didn't even have a real staff at that time. And so when I walked in the room, and Haldeman says to Mr. Nixon, he says, "Oh, I didn't know you had people in here." He said, "I got Bob Brown with me, and we'll just wait outside until you finish." He said, "Oh, no. He said, "These guys are leaving. I got to talk to Bob." He said, "Bring Bob on in. I want to introduce him to these guys." So I came in, and he introduced me. He said, "This is Bob Brown. I want you all to meet him because y'all going to be seeing a lot of him." He said, "He's going to be one of my principal assistants in the White House." Now, we hadn't even had a conversation. And that's where he introduced me to Brownell and Bill Rogers. And so they left. And then Haldeman says, "Do you want me to stick around here?" And he said, "Oh, no, I want to meet with Bob." So the two of us met for a long time, maybe 45 minutes or more. And a lot of the time he's telling me about different things about the blacks that he knew. And he started telling me about this story about E. Frederick Marr, who was in the White House when he was vice president. And he said, "Bob, I know you probably heard, or might know E. Frederick Marr." He said, "Fred Marr was a top-grade guy. He was brilliant, smart." He said, "But they had him sitting as the black sitting beside the door." He said, "They didn't give him any real responsibility." He said that was wrong. He was a brilliant man. He said he was probably smarter than any of the guys that Eisenhower had around him. And he said they just didn't give him a break. He said, "But you don't have to worry about that. You have total access to me." And he says, "In Washington, access is everything. It's everything." And he said, "If you got my confidence and my access," he said, "that's all you need." He said, "Don't make no difference what your title is. If you got access, you got it all." And I found out he was right, and he never changed that. The whole time I was at the White House for 4 years and 3 months. And the whole time I was at the White House, there was never a time when anybody overruled me. I mean, there were times when people tried about anything that I did there, including the president. And there were some very sticky situations. There was one of them where one of the big associations who had given the president a lot of money in his campaign, they wanted to change some of the stuff that I was doing because I was doing the whole black economic development thing and all this. I was getting blacks involved with contracts and grants and stuff that they had never been involved with before. And that was stuff that they had control over. Took all these contracts, and they thought I was treading on their ground. And they asked Haldeman, they told Haldeman they wanted to see the president talk to him about firing me. Because Haldeman came and told me, he says, these guys, he said, "You better tread lightly or whatever." And I said, "I'm just doing what I think the president wants me to do." So Haldeman says, "I got to go tell the president what they want." I said, "Well, tell it, no problem." So he went and told the president what they wanted. And Haldeman calls me back. He said, "Bob," he said, "the president wants you to see them." He said, "But the president said he's not going to see them. They have to come and see you." You have to make peace. And these are guys who are giving him a lot of money. And they came to see me. And I told them, I said, "Hey, look, we want to work this out. But it's not going to be the same thing as it's always been." I said, "We're going to include some minorities, some women in this deal, these deals here now." I said, "You all had it all. But we can't do that. This is a different kind of America that we're going to be running here right now." And the president backed me up. And those guys became friends. I mean, because I was going to take more than I took,
Right. Now, did the president give you a brief as to what exactly he wanted?
Oh, yeah.
To see.
He talked about, he told me in that initial meeting up there in the PR Hotel, he said, look, I've talked about, in the campaign, he talked about black capitalism. He said, I made a speech about blacks being in business and doing this and that and the other. He said, but I don't really, he said, you know more about this kind of thing than I do. He said, you work with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you work with civil rights, you travel all over the country with different black groups and work with the church groups and the school. He said, you need to handle this. He said, I'm looking to you to deal with this. And he said something else that was very important to me. He said, whenever we have a cabinet meeting, he said, you will be at all the cabinet meetings. He said, you'll meet every time the cabinet meets, you will meet. He said, Rosemary will have you. He said, there'll probably be 5 or 6 senior staff in the cabinet meetings. Every cabinet meeting was held. If I was in town, even if I was out of town and could be back there by the time I was in the cabinet meetings, all of them.
Amazing.
I had a chair with my name on it.
Now, was your title was
Special assistant to the president. And then I not only I have a chair, but back then you could do some other things. I brought my chair home. My chair is in my office down the road over there
That's great.
with my name on the back of it.
We'll take a little break.
Okay, start again. How did you end up going to South Africa in the first place? Tell us this story.
Well, I went to South Africa. I had gone there on a couple other occasions with Ambassador Doug Holliday, who was a special ambassador to South Africa. I'd also gone there to take about about 20 black college presidents to South Africa who wanted to go. And the South African government gave us visas to get on in it because it was hard to get a visa. So then Mrs. King called me one day and she said, Bob, she was a very close friend. So she said, Bob, I want to go to South Africa. And you know all those people over there, and because we can't get a visa. She said, my people try to get a visa. So I'll call Pete Kornoff, who was the ambassador from South Africa to the United States. And I had met Pete at a prayer breakfast in Washington. And he considered himself a strong, devout Christian and so forth. So I told him I wanted to see him. He said, okay, you come and have lunch with me, Bob. I said, okay. So I went to the embassy, had lunch with him. I said, Mrs. King, Martin Luther King's widow, says she wants to go to South Africa and she wants to take some of her staff with her, but she can't get a visa to get in the country. And I said, this is not the Christian way. You need to do something else with this. I said, I don't know what this is, Pete. You're supposed to be my Christian brother, but the country's doing this kind of thing. He said, oh, Bob, no, that's not right. Mrs. King wants to go. We will let her, we'll have her visa. He said, you get me all the information and we'll get it worked out. I said, okay. So I'll call Coretta. Coretta has one of the staff to get all the information, all the people want to go. Got the information, and within a few days, we had the visas for everybody who wanted to go. Now, the other problem was, there were a number of people, Ms. King wanted to go, didn't have no money. We were doing it under the banner of the King Center, which she had established. They didn't have any money. So I had to go out and raise the money to make the trip. And so, anyway, we went over there. And one of the things that she said she wanted to do was to go see President Botha to see if we could get him to let Nelson Mandela out of jail. She said, I really think I could do this, Pop. I said, okay, no problem.
This is what year is this, approximately?
This was about 1986, maybe.
Okay, so, yeah.
So we went to South Africa, and when we got there, we met with a group of the people in South Africa, like Dr. Bosak and others, and they all were urging us not to meet, that Mr. King shouldn't meet with President Botha. And he said, okay. And Mrs. King, and some of the people that she had taken with her, and said they were rethinking meeting with President Botha. And so after we got there, we stayed up all night discussing with some of the leadership in South Africa and some of the people who lead us in the U.S., saying that, and most of them came to the conclusion that we shouldn't meet with President Botha. And that's one of the reasons Mrs. King was over there. She was over there for a couple other reasons. And I think one of the other reasons was Bishop Tutu was being made an archbishop at the time. And she was going to attend, we were all going to attend his ceremony. And nobody wanted Mrs. King to meet with President Botha. She wanted to meet with President Botha to ask for him to get Mandela out of jail, let Mandela out of jail. Well, and see, this is something that never really has surfaced, but most of the people in that meeting they didn't want Mrs. King to meet with President Botha. So we thrashed that out over all night long. I mean, literally all night. It was daybreak and we still had talked about this. So Ms. King decided, she said, Bob, I don't want to go against the wishes of the people here on the ground and dealing with this. She said, I'm not going to do this. She said, I'm going to write a letter to President Botha and tell him that I can't meet with him and so forth. So she wrote the letter. And of course, who gets picked to take the letter to the State House? Okay, so I told them I would do it after they picked me. So I went over there to deliver the letter to tell them, the letter told him that she wasn't going to be meeting with him. And because he had agreed to meet with her. And he wouldn't meet with anybody, but he had agreed to meet with her. And she was going to ask for Mandela's release, but she didn't want. So anyway, I took the letter and I went through the gate. They let me through the gate. And I went to President Botha's office, and this guy met me. One of his assistants met me. And I delivered the letter, and I said, please give this letter from Mrs. King to President Botha. And I said she deeply regrets that she could not meet with him at this time. And he looked at me and he said, Mr. Brown, he said, we certainly appreciate Mrs. King being here, and we appreciate you delivering this letter to President Botha, telling him what Mrs. King's wishes were. And he said, we respect her wishes. And I said, thank you very much, and we look forward to maybe greeting you again sometime. So I turned around and left. So I went back, and Ms. King says, Bob, she said, one of the things that I need to do before I leave this country, I need to go see Winnie Mandela. Now, we were in Cape Town. Johannesburg is 2.5 hours away by plane. And so we got in touch with Ms. Mandela. Ms. Mandela said, yeah, I'd love to see Mrs. King. So we flew to Johannesburg, went to Soweto to spend some time with Ms. Mandela. So we're sitting there talking about everything. And so Mrs. King asked Mrs. Mandela, what would be most important to you and Mr. Mandela for us that we could do for you all now? And Ms. Mandela was loud and clear. She said, the thing that Nelson and I want most is for our children to be able to go back to America and go to school. She said there have been a number of people over here who promised that, but nobody has ever delivered. So, people promise in America and you never hear from them anymore. That's what Mrs. Mandela told Ms. King. So Mrs. King looked at me and she says, Bob, is this something that we can do? I knew what she meant, it's something that I could do. So I told her, I told Ms. Mandela, I told Ms. King, I said, yes, I think we can do it. And I said, but what I need is I need a letter from Mrs. Mandela to me personally, asking me to do this. And then I'll set it into motion. And sure enough, about 2 or 3 weeks later, I get a letter from Mrs. Mandela asking me to do this. And so I set it into motion. I called president of Boston University, who's a close friend, and I was on that board. I'm still on that board of trustees of the university. And he agreed to take care of the tuition and so forth, but I would have to take care of all the other expenses, getting them over here, a house, a van, because they had Mandela's 3 grandchildren at the time. It was 4 because she had another child. I think she got here. And they lived here 7 years. 7 years. And I paid for it personally, not some grant I got from a foundation or from a company, from RJB personally. And it was a very expensive proposition, but it was one that I did because I thought we owed it to them. And I had told Mrs. King, who was one of my closest friends, that I would do it, and I did it. Now, that young woman who came over here is now the South African ambassador to Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. She's the only Mandela grandchild, who is in an official position with the government. And that's Zanati.
Incredible story.
So, you never know how things are going to turn out when you're pursuing different kinds of activity. But South Africa was a real challenge.
And you met him as soon as he got out of
I met him inside the jail.
Oh, really?
I have some material that I'll share with you. But I met him inside the jail. They allowed Mrs. Mandela says, look, when I agreed to take them over, bring them back with me, I went over there, and Ms. Mandela said, before you leave this country again, you have to see Nelson Mandela. I said, well, nobody has seen him in 20-some years. How you think they're going to let me see him? I said, they won't even let you all see him but 15 minutes at a time. And you all travel 2.5 hours down there to Cape area from Johannesburg. She said, well, I'm going to try. I'm going to petition President Porter for you to see him, because you're taking you the guardian of his children. And I thought it was a hopeless, useless, hopeless kind of thing for her to do, because I knew they weren't going to do that. The night before I was to leave, I got a call from Neil Van Heerden, who was one of the top assistants to President Porter. And he called me on the telephone at the hotel. He said, Mr. Brown, he said what his name was. He said, I'm calling for President Porter. He asked me to call you to tell you that you have permission. He's granting you permission to see Mr. Mandela tomorrow at Polesmore Prison if you still want to do it. I couldn't believe it. Nobody had seen Nelson Mandela in 20-some years. And these people grant me permission to go to Polesmore Prison to see him inside the prison. I mean, I couldn't. I mean, it was just so. I figured maybe they want to kill me or something, because there were a lot of killings and bombings and everything going on in there. And so I said, "Oh my goodness!" So I prayed over it, and I asked God to give me strength and the guidance and give me the courage to go ahead and do this. So I went down there. I carried Zanani and Prince Mosey, her husband, with me. And so we got to the gate, and, they had all these guns and things there. And I said, oh, my God, this may be it, So the guy brought out his big old pad, and he says, oh, you're Mr. Brown? I said, yeah. He said, we are going to open the gate, and you go to that red brick building up there, and somebody will come and meet you at the door as soon as you get there. So we walked through the gate, walked up there to this brick building, and as soon as I got to the bottom of the steps of that brick building, only about 3 or 4 steps there, this big white guy comes out, and he grabs my hand, and he says, Mr. Brown, he said, I'm the chief warden here, and what you're doing for Mr. Mandela is a marvelous thing for his family, and we all want to congratulate you and for what you're doing for Mr. Mandela and his family. He said, I'm having him brought down from his cell now, and you go into that big room over there in the corner, and you sit in there and you talk to him as long as you want to. Okay. Now, in 20-some years, nobody, his family, who they were only people that had allowed to see him, they would only let him be seen for 15 or 20 minutes, and then sometimes they give him an extra 15 minutes. And they would travel 2.5 hours by plane. And I sat there and talked to him about 2 hours. It was absolutely mind-boggling. He told me what it would take to make peace in South Africa. He talked about a lot of things. I have a memo that I wrote as soon as I got out of there. I was scratching down notes and have a memo that I wrote as soon as I got outside the gate. And I'll give you a copy of it, of the memo that I wrote about our meeting. And then they let me go back the next year. They let me go back to see him again. But by this time, they were talking to him. They had never really had any relationship or talked to him. They wouldn't let anybody talk. But after I saw him, and I wrote this memo, and I passed it on to Mrs. Mandela, she gave it to the ANC. I passed it on to George Shultz, who was Secretary of State. I passed it on to President Porter. I gave Pete Kornoff and those a copy of it so they could send it to President Porter and so forth. So everybody had it. Our side had it, their side had it, ANC had it. Everybody had the memo about what Mr. Mandela was talking about. And so after that, they had started the little conversations with him.
And things started to roll.
One thing led it to another and another. So you just never know what God has in store for you and how he's using you. As my grandmother used to say, just let God have his way. Let him use you. And things will turn out okay. But it was an unbelievable time down there in South Africa.
Amazing.
It's amazing. And then, there were other things that happened during that period. I went into most of the black townships all over the country. And I would go to the schools because I figured that was the schools and see if there were any libraries. Well, there were very few, if almost no libraries, because they wouldn't let them have books. So what I did is I decided to start taking books and sending books. back to South Africa. And so as a result, I would take truckloads of, and I got permission from the South African government that I could bring shoes and clothes. I didn't tell them I was bringing books. So in every box of shoes and clothes, I'd have a half a box of shoes and clothes and a half a box of books, all kind of school books. And so I started doing that on a scale, just, and I would be going there. I'd make it my point to go there, get the books, and then I get a truck from here, have a truck loaded up, and I got permission from the South African government to put those books on South Africa Airways. And they didn't charge me anything for putting them on there. So I put those books in the clothes, because I told them it was shoes and clothes. And if they look in the box, that's what they would see, shoes and clothes. But the other half of the box was number of books. So I did that for several years. I did that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I took books into,
And you still do that, right?
and still do that.
Yeah.
We set up over 300 libraries in South Africa, over 300. We set them up in the Zulu land in Yolande with the king of the Zulus, who is also a good friend. And, you know, before you leave, I'll show you some pictures
Great.
and some of that. You
Great.
know. And we set all over South Africa, because books are still precious in Africa, not just in South Africa. In Africa, books are like gold. A kid gets a book and they start to cry. And we're shredding books over here.
Right.
You know, we're shredding books by the millions. You know, recycling them and that kind of thing. When these people, tens of millions of kids, don't have any books. And they think a book like a piece of gold. They cry many times when they get a book.
Incredible.
Somehow or another, we're going to have to figure that one out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How's your voice?
No way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're rolling.
You ready to start again? So maybe let's start there, if you would. Talk a little bit about President Nixon and his character and how he felt about working on race relations. But I also want to really hear about the work that you were able to do in stimulating the growth of minority businesses at that time.
Well, first of all, I think a lot of people had put together in their own minds that President Nixon was devout racist. He was a devout Quaker, and I don't know any racist Quakers. I know that sometimes President Nixon used some language that he probably regretted or shouldn't have used, but many people do that. But many people didn't have a camera on them when they were doing it, you know. Many presidents have done that, and many top people. I've been around a few when they've used some bad language. So he's not the only one who's done that, but he's the only one who had that camera on him who could show, and so he was condemned for it. But he was not a racist. He was a person, if he believed in you or if he believed in a cause, he was totally for it. And the whole thing of minority business enterprise, he wanted to have blacks and Hispanics and others to get have a shot, because he felt very strongly that if you don't get a shot within the business community or in business in general, that this whole country is built on that. And if you were not involved in that, then it was going to be very limited in terms of what you were going to be able to do in America. And so he wanted that opened up. And my charge was to do that. I went to Wall Street. I went to the biggest banks in the country. The Citigroup was the biggest bank at the time. Met with their chairman and CEO and the vice chairman about the whole Minority Enterprise Program and what we expected of them and their bank to do. They agreed to work with us. We organized a national commission on minority enterprise, and we put the most powerful people in America in it. We designated as chairman of that group Mr. Roach, who was Jim Roach, who was the chairman and CEO of General Motors, which at the time was the largest corporation in America, indeed in the world at that time. He agreed to chair it. Not only did he agree to chair it, but he got other industrial people, other automobile manufacturers to come on in and give dealerships to blacks all over the country. When we went to the White House in late 1968, 69, there were only, I think there were only two, no more than three blacks in America who owned dealerships. And there were very few who were working in many of these major manufacturers, like Chrysler, GM, Ford. Very few who were working, almost none who were working in the executive positions in these companies, in the top executive. Now, I mean, it wasn't, people seem to think that, because you have some blacks there now in some top positions and all that on boards and so forth, that all this just happened by osmosis. It did not happen by osmosis. It happened because we worked at it and made it happen. I met Jim Roach, became a close personal friend of mine. And when I left the White House, he wanted to expand what they were doing in terms of minority enterprise. And General Motors hired my company for several years to go out and spread the word and to get them involved in a whole range of different kinds of activities with minorities across the country. So there were, it just didn't happen, just because I was there and I was sitting up there as a black person. It makes no difference whether you're a black person sitting where I was sitting as a staff person, or if you're a black person sitting as president of the United States. If you want some stuff to happen, you got to work at it. You just can't wish it to happen. You got to make it happen. And that's what we were doing. That's what we did. And that's what the Nixon years were all about. President Nixon, in 1972, when he ran for re-election, he got 20% or more of the black vote. And he was supposed to be, according to some history books and some people, he was supposed to be the devil reincarnated to blacks. No Republican candidate since 1972 has gotten as many black votes as Richard Nixon got in 1972. No candidate. How did that happen when he was supposed to be the devil reincarnated? We had Jim Brown, we had Sammy Davis Jr., we had the president of the Baptist conventions and several Baptist conventions. We had some of the top ministers in the country and bishops of different churches and so forth who came out in support of President Nixon in 1972. That's how it happened. Because they knew we were working closer with them. They knew that we had a major effort to get major money into black colleges. We got the first major money into black colleges ever in America. Richard Nixon did that. There's no president before or since has met with all of the top black that he had in top positions in administration. We would meet with all of them at least once a year, sometimes twice during the course of the year. And people who were in that group were people like Jim Farmer, who was Assistant Secretary of HEW, who was the head of CORE. At that time was considered the most radical organization there was on the scene. He was conducting massive demonstrations and everything else. But we brought him into the administration. as an assistant secretary of HEW in a top job where he could make things happen, where he did make things happen. We had other people there, head of the Women's Bureau in the Labor Department. We had Art Fletcher there, who was assistant secretary of Labor, who came up with the Philadelphia Plan. And all those things to right the ship with regard to employment. All those things started under Richard Nixon. All those things. And we had people in those jobs and who came in mass. We had them in mass in the White House. I have pictures here to show you what we were doing and who we were meeting with. And these pictures would go out to the Washington Post, New York Times, and all that about these meetings and all this stuff that was going on. And I don't think not one, as I recall, not one major newspaper printed any of these pictures. Not one major newspaper. Now, that's something was wrong with that. Not one major newspaper printed any of these pictures of all of this that happened all over the place. So there were so many different things going on. Job situations, EEOC. The first major funding and revamping of EEOC to take it to another level so it could be more effective was done under Richard Nixon. And Bill Brown, who's a big a lawyer who made a lot of strides in America, was chairman of it for 4 years. He's a Philadelphia lawyer, one of the top lawyers in the country, black lawyer. And there were other things like that that happened over and over again, where we brought top people, civil rights leaders and others. Roy Wilkins, Whitney Young. The president met with Whitney Young many times. The president met with Roy Wilkins, who was the head of NAACP, many times. We did all kinds of things as a result of their suggestions.
What about the federal government patronizing black businesses? Was that a priority that they
That was a big priority.
Yeah.
And that was something that I pursued at a White House level. And that Secretary Maurice Stans, who was Secretary of Commerce, he and I worked very closely together on that. He had the responsibility because we set up the Office of Minority Business Enterprise within the Commerce Department. And we pursued that with all of the departments of the government.
Right.
And not only did we pursue it in terms of contracts and grants, but along with all the other things that I was doing, I made sure that the Defense Department, that the other departments that had a lot of money, like General Services Administration and all that, I made sure that they were giving out contracts and grants or whatever they had to black contractors, to the black colleges and universities, just as they were doing to other people that they hadn't been doing before we got there.
Right. Yeah, the figure that I have is that the federal government purchases from black businesses rose from $13 million to $142 million during Nixon's tenure. And it's during your tenure.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I know. Because we monitored it. And, that's another thing we monitored. In the Korean War, not the Korean War, but the Vietnam War was going on at the time. We were having big trouble, the race relation problem. There were big race relation problems. When we got to the White House, that was one of the big problems. And blacks were not being promoted. They were at a certain level. They couldn't go to, when we got to the White House in 1969, when the Nixon was inaugurated, we had, I think, no more than 3 blacks who were admiral or general or something like that. And most of the departments and all that was in the Army, I believe. I think we had one Navy guy, Gravely, Admiral Gravely. I think he was a rear admiral. But that was it when we got there in 1969. One of the things that happened, and I started concentrating on this, and Chappie James, who we brought over to be the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, and gave him a star because he was a colonel. He was an ace pilot in 2 wars, one of the top guys in the military that we've ever had.
Yep.
And he was a colonel, and it was ace pilot in 2 wars. And we brought him over, gave him a star, and put him in the Defense Department. Chappitt came to me one day, and he said, Bob, he said, we're never going to get we're never going to have a representative number of blacks unless we get something going here in this Defense Department. It's never going to happen. So I said, we're going to do something about it, Chappitt. So I talked to Haldeman about it, and he said, let me go talk to the president. Let me tell him. And he said, I'm on my way to talk to the president now. I talked to him, see what he says, then I'll call you back. About 2 or 3 hours later, I get this call from Haldeman. Haldeman said, Bob, I talked to the president, and the president thinks you're exactly right, and he wants to be helpful. He said he figured out the way that he could be helpful is that every month they send over the list of flag officers, because as a commander-in-chief, he has to sign off on it. And so in order to do something about that, Bob, he said, what I'm going to do, and the president agreed, what I'm going to do is send you the list when it comes over, and you check it out and see if there are any minorities on the list. He said, if there are no minorities, he said, you let me know, and we'll send it right on back. We sent it back about 3 or 4 times in a row. Unsigned. Unsigned. Nobody got promoted. Unsigned. And so all of a sudden, it must have dawned on somebody at the Pentagon that we better do something else. So they started putting some blacks on there, put a woman on there and stuff like that. And so I would check it out. Every time we come over, I'd check it out. And so when they started doing that, we sent it back. By the time I left the White House in 1973, we had a whole lot of black generals. Okay? A lot of them. And then they congregated all over the place after that. By the time I left there, Chappitt James, who had never had a star when we got there, we gave him his first star. By the time I left, he had 3 stars. He had 3 stars. And he was the head of our military base in Denver, that strategic base that we have out there. And, but there were just so many things like that happened over and over. I mean, there was vastly important. It changed the way we did business in America, with the military, with business people, with all facets of what we were trying to do. But we had to wade in on it. I even set up a special commission. I did this myself because I had the president's okay to do whatever. I set up a special commission to go around the world because we were having race relations problems on military bases all over the world. I set up a special commission to go around the world to check this out and meet with the service people in all these bases. We found out all kind of problems. And then I would go from time to time, I would go myself, unannounced, until I got right there near the base, and then I'd have somebody, one of the military guys on the plane with me, to call the base and tell them that I'm going to be landing this plane. You're going to be landing this plane in the next 30 minutes. And that I wanted to meet with the commanding officer. Because we'd have intelligence that would be telling us what was happening on different places. I went to Hawaii. Spent a lot of time in Hawaii because we have a lot of military bases there.
Sure do, yeah.
And the person who was the head of SINGPAC, all of our armed forces in the Far East and from Hawaii on back, was none other than General John McCain. John McCain's father. I have a picture with him around here somewhere with him, he and I meeting over there in Hawaii. We became good friends as a result of that,
Incredible.
And so it was quite a time.
Yeah. Amazing work that you did there. So I have just okay, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay, we're going again.
Yeah, so just conclude if you could tell us about SEAL tests and AMP.
Well, I got this call one day from one of the guys who was traveling with Dr. King, and Dr. King was in Cleveland, and he said that Dr. King wanted to talk to me, and he wanted to meet with me, and if I don't mind coming out there. And I said, oh no, I'll catch the next plane out there. So I went out to the airport, jumped on the plane, went to Cleveland, and when I got there, Dr. King came in the room, and he said, Bob, he said, we got a problem here. And he said, we got a problem with seal tests. He said, you know, we've been trying to meet with them and get them to hire black truck drivers and do some other kinds of things that they need to be doing. And he said, they won't even meet with me. They refuse to meet with me or any of my people. And he said, I'm wondering if you have any suggestions of what we can do. And I told him, I said, yeah. I said, what I need to do, I said, I have this relationship with the people at A&P, with the top people at A&P, which at the time was the largest supermarket chain in America. Mm-hmm. And I said, you know, I will go to them, I'll call them up, see if I can see them, and then I'll fly there immediately and see what I can do about it. And he said, well, we need to do something because we want to make some progress, but we're going to have to, we don't want to tear up everything and making progress. So I flew to New York and got a meeting with the CEO of A&P. And when I went in the room, we expressed greetings and so forth. And I told him, I said, let me get right to the point. Here's the point. I said, Dr. King and his people are in the Cleveland, Ohio area, and they've been having a lot of problems with seal test dairy. I said, the seal test management won't meet with Dr. King or any of his people. And I said, there's going to be big trouble there. Mm. And I said, we do not need the A&P stores, because the A&P was a client of mine. So I said, we don't need the A&P stores involved in this. We're trying to make, room in all of the states where A&P is located to have a new relationship. And I said, we need to be in front of this. And he said, well, Bob, what would you recommend? I said, I would recommend that that you have somebody to get in touch with A&P, one of our top executives, and let them know, with seal tests, and let them know that we have a problem with this, and we don't want to be involved some kind of way. Mm-hmm. And he said, yeah, you're right, Bob. Then he called in one of his top assistants. He came in the room and he said, look, Bob's been telling me about this problem with seal tests. And he said, yes, sir, we know all about it. So it's a problem out there in the Midwest. And he said, well, I want you to call the top people at seal tests and tell them that if they don't get this situation right with Dr. King, that we are going to take seal test products out of all of the stores in Ohio. Now, I had recommended initially that maybe we ought to look at taking the products out of all the stores in Cleveland. He told him to tell me he's going to take the products out of all the stores in Ohio. Before I could hardly get out of the building, because I had some more meetings there, before I could get out of the building, I called my office, and my office told me that Mr. Brown, Dr. King's people are desperately trying to reach you. They're still in Cleveland. They need you to talk to you. So I called him. Called Dr. King. Dr. King said, Bob, he said, I don't know what you told them people. He said, but the top people at seal tests have called me several times already. They want to meet this afternoon. They want to meet in the morning. Anytime we can meet, they want to meet. They're ready to meet and work with us any way they can. So they went and met with him. And that night, Dr. King called a mass rally in Cleveland, in a big church there at Reverend Hoover's church, O.D. Hoover, my Olivet Baptist Church. And so Dr. King made this speech. And in his speech, he talked about SEAL tests, and he talked about me. He said, you know, we've made a major breakthrough here like we haven't made in a while. He said, but what SEAL test didn't realize that we had Bob Brown on our side, and he's on our board of directors, and he was the man that made this stuff happen and so forth. And it's recorded. There's a recording about this. You know, I have one somewhere in the office or somewhere. There's a recording on his speech and what he was talking about. He said, this is what we're going to do now. You know, this is the way of the future and so forth. And he talked about my role in it and everything else and what I'd done for that CLC.
Amazing.
So
Yeah.
it was an amazing time. It's an amazing time.
I mean, as I said when we started this a couple of hours ago, that it's not just the marches, but it's these kinds of pressures and arm twisting in the back. This is how this thing changes.
If you're not doing that, if you're not making something happen, because it's all about jobs and different kinds of opportunities, contracts with minority business people, all of this. This is what makes the whole thing go round. This is what makes it all a success. You know, because the businesses and the jobs are going on all the time. It's just that you need participation by all the people. Blacks, browns, grays, whatever they are, need all the people to participate. And during the 50s and the 60s, for the most part, and sometimes in the 70s, you had only the whites who were participating in all this. They had SEAL tests, and the rest of the milk companies didn't even have any black. They were taking milk throughout all these communities. They had thousands of trucks and truck drivers delivering milk. You remember the milk truck drivers?
Sure.
They didn't have any blacks.
Not a single driver.
Not a single driver. Delivering black people milk every which way. Thousands of black people, tens of thousands. Didn't have one single driver, black. We changed that. You know, there's just so many different things like that happened during that time. I mean, a lot of people look at stuff now and they think it just happened, you know, like out of the clear blue sky. Somebody just got religion one day and said, we're going to help the black people. You know, no, it didn't happen like that. You had to do some pressure put on. And that's what has to happen now. I mean, you know, this thing with Mr. Obama taking the money away from the black colleges, and there are tens of thousands of students who can't go back to school right now, black kids, because they tighten up the money, the credit crunch on the parents who could not get the loans anymore because the administration did that, you know. And so many of the black colleges, you watch, over the next year or two, many of the black colleges are going to be closing down. Can't stay open. They don't have students.
So, you tell me when.
It's all right.
Okay, so I'll just ask you if you have any concluding remarks you'd like to make. I mean, anything that I didn't ask you that I should have asked, or you're expecting me to ask that I didn't, or anything else you'd like to say.
No, I think you've done a great job. I appreciate you coming, and I appreciate what you all are doing, and not just for your departments and history departments, all that, but for what the museum is doing and what it will represent to ages yet unborn, to those kids, and to many of the young people today. They have absolutely no idea what went on. And they'll get this from this museum and what you all are doing now. And it'll be a guidepost for many people, white, black, whoever, to see what has happened and to give them some sense of what they ought to be doing in the years and years ahead. So I appreciate what you've done and what you continue to do.
Well, thank you so much. And yeah, it's been a battle just to get the museum, as you know.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah.
But I never thought that we would have a Black History Museum right there in the heart of Washington, in the probably the most prime spot that you can put a museum in the capital of the world. I think it's fantastic. Every time I go by there, the tears just well up in my eyes now, and I'm back and forth in Washington all the time. But I think it's a wonderful, magnificent thing. And I congratulate you, all of you, for what you've done, and especially Lonnie and the board and everybody involved. I think you've done a great job, and I'm looking forward to seeing the finished product and to getting a lot of young people, blacks and whites and others there see it. In particular, there's some young people from Africa. I think they need to see this. That would help them a great deal. And I'm in touch with a lot of them. We're still sending a lot of books into schools there, and many of them who can come over here to visit. So I'm going to be taking, when you finish, I'm going to be taking a lot of them to that museum.
Fantastic. Well, what a great way to end. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been just terrific.
Who would you like for me to do a video on next? What are your thoughts about this video? Please share them in the comments. Now please be honest when answering these questions. Share this video with anyone you deem necessary. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.